technology to address labor rights and some issues in supply chains. There's lots of technology issues. Cool. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join your class. I'm a Haas grad I graduated 2017. So it's always a pleasure to be able to come back to interact with students on campus. And I'm definitely here to talk to anyone who wants to continue the conversation afterwards. I am a bit tired. I was up for a webinar at 5 a.m. So my ability to speak eloquently definitely goes down throughout the day. So I will just try to keep it real with you guys and share what I've been learning in this space. So you'll have to excuse my lack of eloquency. Let's see. I wanted to share a bit about my background. So I ended up at Humanity United. I heard that you heard from Ryan Heeman, my colleague, and we have very different kinds of backgrounds. And so I just wanted to shed a bit of light about that. I initially started working at Boeing right after undergrad in their finance rotational program, and had my initial exposure to startups there. I was managing the cohort of defense-related startups, seeing how they were being integrated, and I was just personally having a hard time. One of the startups was in cybersecurity and was used to turn off the internet in the Arab Spring in Egypt. And so definitely felt a bit of values alignment challenge there, and ended up taking a sabbatical to go to Nairobi, Kenya, where I worked with Kiva Zip to pilot and launch their new direct peer-to-peer microloan product. And then ended up staying. I really enjoyed being part of the community there of social enterprises and entrepreneurs in Nairobi. And so I worked with Global Village Energy Partnership, which was a grant-funded really consultancy that was working with the solar home system distributors in all over Africa. There's a lot of private equity money coming in. These, $200 loan for a solar panel, 4 lights, and a cell phone charger. It was really seen as the way to power Africa. And so I was getting to work more closely with startups that had more of a social impact mission. And I very quickly realized that I did not know how to use financial statements. I didn't know how to help scale these companies well. And so I ended up coming to Haas. And my intent initially was to dive into the hard skills, to even look at going into banking and just really approach impact investing with this hard skill lens. Very quickly realized that I did not like working in Excel. I did not enjoy really any of these classes around financial analysis, really in service to corporates. And so I started to take more human rights and business related classes, looked at social impact metrics. There were a few interesting courses on, working with teams with students from different kinds of backgrounds, whether it was policy or engineering, and just started to learn about the issues that corporates were having when it came to human rights, and how challenging these issues were, that there weren't very easy answers, and started to really develop compassion and empathy for, quote unquote, other side, and seeing how being able to tackle issues around child labor in cocoa in West Africa, they couldn't be solved overnight. And so that was my real introduction into this challenging world of human rights and business. So I'll just wrap up with saying I did an internship at Nest, an early stage impact investor, tried going to Deloitte as a last ditch effort to go to a large company, and was working in their social impact service line, and just found that it just was really far away from impact for me. So I ended up at Humanity United, which has been a really interesting way to marry my experience both in corporates and working with early stage social enterprises. So I will say that I guess one of the biggest influences for me in starting to look at supply chains and gain this awareness of, yes, we're disconnected from the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the electronics we use, but really like what's going on and what is at the root of transparency. And there's a Planet Money podcast about the T-shirt project. And they went through like, why is it so hard to make a T-shirt that doesn't involve slave labor or, pesticides and whatnot. And I haven't listened to it in a while. It's a bit old. And so I'm sure the dollar value would change, but I think it was about $75 for a plain white T-shirt if you wanted to make it, clean, quote unquote, clean. And so that was kind of my initial foray into understanding the economics involved with just production of all different kinds of goods. And I started to learn more about value chains. And so I'm sure you guys have gone through this a bit, but just as an example, looking at a phone, I got this phone from Apple, which is that multinational corporate level. And they work with hundreds of suppliers to create all of the different components in these phones. There are recruitment agents involved to source the labor to put this together. And often those workers are paying $2,000-$3,000 for that job, where they're brought from Nepal to a factory in Malaysia. And then essentially in debt bondage until they can pay off the loans or the fees that they've paid for that job. And then those workers are essentially putting these together, full of so many materials from all different places around the world. And I just started to understand that, very simple things like a phone or a sweater, like there are so many complicated steps, and a quote unquote supply chain is really opaque. And a company like Apple, when they say where is everything coming from, they honestly don't know. And so that was when I started to learn about technology to be able to help with these issues of opaque supply chains, of different levels of abuse at different layers in the supply chains, and really starting to bring these issues to light. And so I was very lucky to be able to take a job out of graduation. I did wait 6 months though. So I will say, for some of you who are like, I'm going to hold out for the right thing, I was definitely one of those lucky ones, but it didn't come easy. There was a bit of waiting involved. But I was able to join Humanity United, which is a philanthropy, a foundation that's focused on human rights within the Omidyar group. And initially we focused a lot on peace building. And as they started to look at human trafficking and forced labor, they saw that so much of the human trafficking and forced labor in the world, it's happening in more or less legal supply chains, things, that we don't really expect to be so out in the open. And so initially they started looking at different commodities, whether it was gold or palm oil or seafood, and trying to understand the modern slavery involved there. And then they realized that these kinds of challenging working conditions for vulnerable workers were happening around the world. And there needed to be different kinds of interventions, whether it was investigative journalism from The Guardian, or in this case, different kinds of software, something that could be an app on a phone for a worker to use to be able to bring these situations of forced labor to light. And so with that came a few different interesting investments, which I'll talk about, as well as an impact investment fund. So a $25 million fund that they were able to raise from several different impact investors, as well as corporates, including Walmart and Disney and Apple. And really just with an experiment of, can we scale technology to help bring light to these issues, and help corporates have more ethical, transparent supply chains. And as they started to get going, they saw that there were a lot of companies out there, and a lot of them were not ready for formal venture funding. And so with that came a philanthropic fund, full of technical assistance grants, usually about $75,000 to $250,000, depending on where the company was at, to help support really early stage companies. The Department of International Development in the UK gave us most of the funding to work with for that. And they were really just grants to 20 different companies to see either could they pilot their technology in a factory, could they take a technology that was really successful, and then apply it to labor rights. Looking at, some nonprofits, could they switch over to a for-profit model? And so we got to engage with different areas in different areas of technology, looking at responsible recruitment of workers, worker engagement, traceability, and big data or risk assessment. So those were the main areas. And as we started to look at different kinds of companies, we found that there were a few, really great things about technology. You could reach scale. So even if a factory had many different workers, and they had different kinds of programs to, either health and safety, information programs for those workers, if they were able to deliver that information not only on site, they could also do it through an app for a phone. They would be able to meet so many different workers that, were ones that they had known about that were coming into the factory, or who had also been working at home. And so just really expanding the reach for those that could be met. Obviously, cost-effective implementation, if you don't have to have a person who is doing audits necessarily, talking to every single person, but they're able to survey hundreds of workers at one time. They really just saw how effective they could be at moving quickly to get the kind of information, labor rights information that they wanted. Information could be real time. There's some really interesting worker voice tools that allow workers to put grievances in, say, I'm not getting paid the right amount. I'm being harassed in a certain way, and they could have that real time. They didn't have to wait. Sometimes audits are done every 2 years. So they didn't have to wait that long to find out what were the issues going on in the workplace. And then lastly is large scale data gathering. And so to demonstrate some of these exciting elements of technology, I wanted to bring in an example of Simulanis, which is a virtual reality and augmented reality training company. They work in India, and you can see on the top, these are some of the kinds of machinery in pharmaceutical factories. And so often there are workers who are illiterate who are coming in to use these machines, and they're often given huge stacks of manuals and health and safety codes and information, which they quite frankly cannot engage with in the same way as other workers. And so there is a very high rate of dismemberment, of other injuries, and even death in these pharmaceutical factories in India. And so Simulanis was able to say, hey, we want to deliver this information in a very different way, and give people a chance to learn how to do their job, and really practice. And so by going into the headset, they're able to see the machines, to practice the movements. We worked with Simulanis to do some backend and analytics to see where are people really messing up as they do the different tests. How are they learning? And to really give the employers more information about their workers to be able to support them, and have a better experience working in those settings. At the same time, there's a lot of pitfalls of technology, and I think these have really been coming to light in the last few years. Really, the most important one to focus on are the privacy risks that workers face as they utilize technology. There's a lot of surveillance technology and technology that tries to see how efficient workers are. And generally, there's a good intent of saying, okay, we want to, have to understand the productivity of our workers. And yet there's also the risk of the least productive workers being fired, or if there are grievance mechanisms, a worker who's saying, hey, I'm having a problem with my manager, hey, this is going on, they'll get fired or even targeted. And so this is something that we've definitely become more cognizant of as a funder. We engage with grantees and technology developers in a very different way now. We're much slower at the beginning of our engagements and bring in responsible data experts, because we have seen these kinds of pitfalls happen where we're actually creating more harm than good. And so it's definitely, I think, just really coming to light right now as something to be cognizant of. Two other areas that we've seen are that the data gathered can often be insufficient to lead to change. And so, you may have really good information about what's happening in one factory out of hundreds. And so even though these issues are really prevalent in one, if the decision-making that's happening at the corporate level, doesn't take the data seriously or doesn't think it's something that's common enough to make changes, there won't be something meaningful happening to that initial factory that showed that where there were issues. The other issue that comes up is that because many of these issues don't have specific regulation related to them, there is more of a compliance orientation that corporates can take. If there isn't a specific legal ramification, then they will do what they need to do to meet the law, and that's it. Obviously, there are leaders and laggards, and we work a lot with the leaders to say, what can your engagement with workers and desire to create a more safe and healthy and workplace look like. But there are certainly so many laggards that just do the minimum necessary, if that at all. One of the I wouldn't say it was a failure, but one of the companies that was interesting to follow was called Sundar, which kind of fell into this camp of being really exciting when we initially started out. It's an ethical sourcing platform. So if I were a buyer at Levi's and I needed to buy all of these things on the list, zippers, denim, all of these different things, there would be a website where I could go to source all of these things. And as I looked at all of the different suppliers of these different items, I could see how they were rated based on their labor rights practices or even environmental sustainability practices. And so this was super exciting. It was one of the first grants we made from the Sidecar Fund, and then also one of the first investments from the Working Capital Fund. And there was just a lot of promise that they could scale very quickly. They could reach anyone, being essentially a platform that could provide so many different kinds of things that any corporate buyer would need. And what ended up happening was that there were some challenges around seeing, how often this data was updated. So just because one supplier was given a seal, a gold seal one year, if that supplier wasn't audited within the year later, there was no transparency into the labor practices there. And also, if they weren't having many folks using the platform, how were those suppliers that expected that increase in business, how much were they willing to commit to keeping up with having great practices and meeting labor standards? And so it was one of those interesting companies that we thought would kind of solve a lot of problems, and ended up just not having enough traction, and I believe has closed or is operating at a much lower capacity now. I wanted to share about Open Apparel Registry. It's one of my pet projects, one of my favorites that we've come across over the last 2 years as we made grants to these many different technology providers. We started to see that there's a lot of data available, but the data is generally siloed. So if I am a worker voice tool, and I am being used by lots of different brands to survey workers, they're finding out that there are labor abuses in many different places associated with many different brands. And so that information is very sensitive and often does not get shared beyond the brand itself or beyond the supplier itself. And so we saw that there's a lot of information out there. It's not being shared. And we're very curious about ways that there can be more open, integrated data ecosystems to give the right actors, whether it's civil society, trade unions, different kinds of actors that will support the organizing of workers, or even brands, give them access to that information so they understand what is going on in the different workplaces. And so Open Apparel Registry, it's a very creative approach to a very challenging problem. They essentially give every factory in the world an ID, a unique identifier, and that's used, that is given. You can see these different kinds of numbers that's given in relation to the GPS location. And it sounds really simple, but it's actually solving a really challenging problem. You can see for Agile Sweater Company in Cambodia, there are often dozens of names that this company will go by. So even if multiple brands work with Agile Sweater Cambodia Company Limited, they may be contracting under various different names. And so if two brands, Levi's and Target, were to say, hey, do we have some of the same suppliers? What's going on in these suppliers? Can we work together to protect labor rights there better? There's no way for them to know, is this the exact same one, until OAR has come about and given Agile Sweater Cambodia Company Limited a specific ID. You can also see how many different addresses are given out. In many places there are no street names and numbers, and so this just really solves a very, simple problem that is super important to many different actors. So brands want to know who's in their supply chains. Trade unions would love to know where are workers working, so they could then go after them or address grievances that aren't being addressed. And suppliers want to know themselves who they're working for. And so it's a very unique approach to something that is now being used by Business and Human Rights Resource Center, for instance. So if you follow any human rights news, you probably have come across BHRC. There's an awesome example, which I wanted to share, of how they were able to use OAR. They were basically able to trace back brands after a factory closure in Mauritius. The closure had actually left Bangladeshi migrant workers stranded and with owed wages. This was in August 2019. And so after after research using OER to see which companies these workers had worked for, had been providing garments to brands in Western countries, they were able to identify the brands, and then BHRC was able to launch a campaign to work with a local trade union to ensure that remedial steps were taken, which included back wages, reemployment for some workers, repatriation talks with the Mauritian government, and even reinstallation of water and power lines in certain factory environments that didn't have these basic utilities. So it's just for me, it's just a very clever way where they've been able to, OER has been able to make a public data set usable to so many different kinds of stakeholders. This is just a last kind of overview of a few other companies that I've really grown to love and see the power of to create change and impact in work environments. Quizr is a company, a Scandinavian company, and it's quite simple, but they essentially create health and safety and labor rights trainings. They animate them, they put them in local languages, and workers are able to watch them either on iPads in factory environments or on their phones. And these trainings teach people about their rights in places where it's just very culturally appropriate to not have any. And so to say, hey, you are allowed to have a break or to receive your wages or to not pay a middleman. They've been able to create these kinds of trainings and have them used in, factories for companies like H&M in ways that have really made a difference for the workers in those factories. Ulula is a worker voice tool. And so you can see they essentially send surveys to different kinds of cell phones, whether feature phones or smartphones. And then they're able to get real-time insights and deliver those to different brands as well as suppliers. And so they're able to see not only what are those grievances, where are things going wrong, but they're able to then also note, have they been addressed? And workers can confirm whether or not their issue has been addressed. Philogen is super cool. It's one of these futuristic kinds of companies that I didn't know was possible, but essentially they are able to trace microbiome on the surfaces of different things. So for instance, if I have a shoe and that was produced in a certain factory, generally speaking, most factories have a microbiome of dust that will get on everything, including the shoe that was produced. And so Philogen is able to take this shoe that Nike says, was supposed to come from a certain supplier and say, hey, this dust matches the dust of your supplier that you've contracted with. They're also able to say, this does not match anything that we're finding from that contracted supplier, and you have unauthorized subcontracting happening in your supply chain. They're also, if you check out their website, they're very cool. They've basically mapped out the entire city of San Francisco and have different, points of what those microbiomes look like from different neighborhoods. And so they're just able to do tracing in a really unique way. And then I will also say that they're a really unique case in that there's a lot of commercial applications for this technology. One of them being, Department of Homeland Security would love to engage with them to understand immigration in a different way, ways that may not be as supportive of, the rights of migration as many would like them to be upheld. And so Philogen having an impact investor on their board, they're able to have a voice that says, look, you don't have to take necessarily the highest revenue producing contract, but you can actually work on things that are really meaningful, like identifying unauthorized subcontracting or forced labor. So that's one of those really cool companies to see where they go in the next few years. And then the last one that was our first grant and also the first investment that we did. It's called Provenance. It's a blockchain for traceability platform. And I think they started out with, I want to say tuna in Southeast Asia. But essentially, being able to say at every point in the value chain, where is this fish, located, who is touching it, how are they being treated, what are the working conditions, and putting that all onto the blockchain so that even consumers in some cases can have access to that and see that line. And so I'll stop there. Happy to take questions. These are definitely take a look at Working Capital's portfolio. They have some really interesting companies that they're looking at now and starting to expand. And then happy to also chat with anyone who has further questions. So that's my email over there.